Thanks very much, Tim. As Tim mentioned, my name is Emma Ross. I'm the practice leader for consumer and healthcare at Alva. I'm joined by a couple of my colleagues sort of dotted throughout the audience, Alistair Pickering and Mark Wilson, so I'm sure you'll be introduced to them later on today. As Tim mentioned, we're going to be looking specifically at the issue of sugar today in relation to three different sort of subsectors. So to run through To run through the structure of the presentation, we're first going to start by looking at the media discussion of sugar and the impact on the reputation of cereals, soft drinks, and confectionery. We'll then take a look at the consumer voice, so sugar and consumer advocacy. And then we'll take a look at sentiment towards alternative sweeteners, so things like stevia, aspartame, saccharin, and ACE-K. We'll finish off by looking at what the key takeaways are, and then I'll hand it over to David from Populous, and we'll have time for Q&A after that. So I imagine it would be helpful to give a bit more background on Alva besides what Tim has already shared with you guys and the methodology behind what we do. And then we can take a look at the sort of subset of content that we've looked at specifically for this study. So Alva is a content analytics company. We monitor and analyze the world's publicly available content to help answer business questions. And we have a particular specialism in corporate reputation. So as you can see from our infographic, we have we sort of aggregate all publicly available content, traditional, print, online media, social media, publicly available polls and surveys. This content is then categorized and scored. And this allows us to give reputation or sentiment scores to companies, sectors, issues, stakeholders, etc. So for this study, we looked primarily at two different types of content, mainstream media and consumer media generated on social media. So in having conversations with Ian Wright and the FDF staff, we identified the three sectors that we wanted to investigate, and those were soft drinks, cereal, and confectionery. And as I mentioned, these were chosen in consultation with the FDF as subsectors that would be of interest to the organization and its members as relates to the sugar issue. So for each sector, we defined a sort of definition, and the filter definition incorporated both general words related to that sector, so things like soft drink or cereal, but also the top 10 most visible brands in the UK for each. And this was to sort of correct for the fact that the media and consumers may refer to specific brands as sort of poster children or representatives of an entire sector, but also may refer to the sector more generally. So we wanted to capture both of these sources of information. So the first section that we're going to look at looks purely at media discussion of sugar. So this includes national, regional, trade, and financial media, and its impact on the reputation of these three subsectors. And we wanted to separate out the media impact from consumer or social media, as we wanted to test the hypothesis that thought and opinion leaders tended to pick up traction first in mainstream media before consumers sort of voiced too much concern. Now, to understand this, Alva looked at mainstream media content from January to December 2015, and then ran a sort of sentiment line for the period for the sector overall. What we then did is took out all content referencing sugar and reran this sentiment line for each. So this isolated the impact that sugar had on the reputation of each subsector, allowing us to identify which sectors were most negatively impacted and which issues tended to drive negativity or positivity in the media sphere. So we had three key findings, which I'll take you through in a bit more detail, but the sort of top line findings were that cereal was actually the most negatively impacted sector out of the three analyzed over this 1 year period. Soft drinks had the highest visibility as related to sugar, but the industry fairly effectively neutralized coverage around this issue. Sugar content tended to benefit confectionery, as these products were often compared to other perceived to be healthier products. So first, let's take a look at cereal, the subsector, as I said, most negatively impacted by sugar in 2015. So if you look at the slide that we have up on the screen now, the dark yellow line is the sentiment line for cereal over the year. So this takes into account all, as I said, sort of media, mainstream media content. The lighter yellow line, if you can see that from your seats, is the sentiment line if we remove references to sugar. So you can see very clearly there what the difference is between those two sentiment lines. The gray line running across the middle at 5.5 is the neutral point. Alva scores between 1 and 10, with 10 being the most positive, 1 being the most negative. So 5.5 is that neutral point. And the bars along the bottom of the graph represent the volume of mainstream media content referencing the cereal industry. So you can see that we had a score differential of minus 12.9%, with 67% of sugar coverage negative. So when we dug a bit deeper into what was driving this negativity, we found a couple of key points. So the inclusion of what was termed hidden sugar in cereals that were perceived to be healthy by parents, for example, drove negativity in this sector more than the other two that we analyzed. And you can see that big sort of spike in volume right around mid-March when we had sort of high-profile media coverage sort of harping on this point. There was also a narrative in national media that sugar levels in popular cereals have increased over the past 3 years, and you can actually see that a bit earlier in the year, that other volume peak in late January. Now, additionally, compared to the soft drink sector, we found less coverage of any sort of industry reaction. So there was limited coverage around reduced sugar product variants than we saw in something like soft drinks. So when we look at soft drinks then, what we see is actually higher visibility around sugar, or more prevalent discussion of sugar is related to soft drinks. And we have it 16.5% versus about 6% in the cereals subsector. Now, most negativity came at the time of the release of the SACN report and the Jamie Oliver sort of war on sugar. You can see a big dip there in the darker green sentiment line. And most of this negativity focused on the link between soft drink consumption and weight gain and type 2 diabetes. However, what came through in our analysis is that in 2015, the soft drinks industry much more effectively neutralized coverage around sugar by releasing reduced sugar and sugar-free product variants. So sugar still had an overall negative effect. There's a minus about 8% score differential, but a higher proportion of this coverage was neutral. And you can see that visually in the chart as well. Aside from that sort of dip around the sort of August-September period, the two lines are much closer together than they were in the cereal sort of sector. Now let's take a look at confectionery. So as with the other graphs, the darker line represents sentiment towards confectionery generally, including sugar content. And the lighter colored line is sentiment towards confectionery with references to sugar taken out. Now, what we see here, which is different from the other two sectors, is that sugar content is actually having a positive effect in confectionery. So the expectation is that confectionery products contain sugar, and the media opinion leaders, by and large, accept that. Now, interestingly, we saw a few peaks of positivity throughout the year where confectionery was compared to other sort of quote-unquote healthier food products that contained actually or were found to contain more sugar, so things like yogurt or cereal. Now, while confectionery benefited from sugar coverage and doesn't seem to be in immediate danger of a sort of media storm of criticism, we still did see praise for the introduction of sugar-free products, and we saw that towards the end of the year, sort of early December. And jumping back to the earlier point, that large sort of peak in volume was media coverage saying that some cereal bars belong in the confectionery aisle. So that goes back to that sort of comparative point. So there is still positivity to be gained in the space of sort of sugar-free products. And as we'll see, a lot of consumer discussion is actually focused around sugar-free confectionery. So there is this sort of positivity to be gained there, but it seems as though these product variants are already accepted as being readily available in this sector. So if we put all of these lines together on the same chart, it becomes apparent which sector was impacted by sugar negativity the most consistently throughout the year, and that was cereal, as I said, the yellow lines. However, we see that these two lines do grow closer together towards the end of the year, perhaps with no surprise that there was greater discussion in this period of lower sugar alternatives here towards the end of the year. We can see the purple lines along the top, again, that's confectionery. So perception of confectionery goods was the highest of these three sectors, with or without mention of sugar. So now that we've looked at the influence of media on the discussion around sugar, let's try and understand the consumer voice. So the next stage in our analysis was to isolate consumer-generated content on social media to understand if consumer concern or positivity mirrored what was coming through in the media, and which issues prompted active advocacy or active criticism from consumers. Now, this methodology is part of Alva's social media advocacy program, which is something that we initially developed with a partner in the financial services sector, but is something now that we've rolled out across several other sectors as well. And this is really to identify what drives consumer advocacy and switching behavior, which is what we'll see sort of come through in the findings. So our key findings in this section were that consumer concern around cereals' health effects did lead discussion within that subsector, but this didn't really emerge until the second half of the year, and we identified about a 4-month lag time between the sort of peak of media discussion around sugar in cereal and when consumers picked up on this in social media. For soft drinks, discussion of sugar-free product variants actually dominated consumer discussion. And then the majority of consumer discussion around sugar and confectionery referenced the availability of sugar-free products, with again some consumer criticism 4 months after significant media coverage in mainstream media. Now, when we looked at each of these subsectors over the year, we took two views. One was a view on advocacy versus criticism, which you'll see in the pie chart on the right, and one is a view on key themes that drove discussion from consumers, which is the pie chart on the left. Now, for cereal, which is what we're looking at here, we see that active criticism and active advocacy were split fairly evenly over the year. Now, when I talk about advocacy, as I sort of made reference to earlier, Alva has a sentiment scoring system. So we score sentiment between 1 and 10. And we have a sentiment dictionary that we've developed that identifies positive or negative mentions towards a specific entity at a sentence by sentence or mention by mention level. So what we've developed in terms of advocacy is a sort of layer on top of that identifies not only positive and negative consumer sentiment, but advocacy or active advocacy is when very strong emotion is expressed, or some sort of intent to purchase or not purchase, or some sort of switching behavior or brand loyalty. So that's how we differentiate between active advocacy and passive advocacy, and active criticism and passive criticism. And you see that reflected in the color scheme, hopefully, in the pie chart. So when we look at what drove this active criticism and advocacy for cereals, 46% of content mentioned cereals' high sugar content, 20% discussed using extra sugar to improve the taste of healthy cereals, and only 17% of consumers discussed a lower sugar product variant in the cereal space. Now, interestingly, as I mentioned, when we looked at this consumer content chronologically over the year, consumer criticism tended to peak about 4 months after critical coverage in national media. So we did identify about a 4-month lag period. However, when we look at consumer-generated soft drinks content through these same lenses, we see that 54% of consumer discussion did reference sugar-free product variants. And this goes back to our point around media coverage, that the soft drinks industry did a much better job, seemingly, than cereal in 2015 in releasing lower sugar products and making these visible to consumers. And 22% of consumer discussion still mentioned soft drinks' high sugar content, and 20% mentioned Jamie Oliver's war on sugar in fizzy drinks. He was a driver of discussion as related to soft drinks, more than either of the other two sectors that we looked at, which is probably no surprise. Finally, 4% related to the taste of sugar-free products, and this was usually a driver of criticism rather than advocacy in this space. So when we look at the advocacy chart on the right, there was more overall active or passive advocacy than in cereals, so more positivity, but there was still a substantial 40% of content that was active criticism. And this linked back in most cases to those three sections of the pie chart on the left: high sugar content, Jamie Oliver, and the taste of sugar-free products. Now let's take a look at confectionery. So we see a couple of things here that are really striking. This subsector generated 56% active advocacy from consumers, with only about a third of all discussion some sort of criticism. Now, of the themes discussed by consumers, 77% mentioned sugar-free products. So though confectionery in general doesn't seem to suffer from sugar coverage, even when there is a sort of perceived high level of sugar content in the products, consumers are seemingly very aware of sugar-free alternatives. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is likely because this sector has, I suppose, made less of a secret, so to speak, of the amount of sugar in most of their products, and so for several years has also had these sugar-free alternatives on the market. Now, there was about a third of consumer content that was negative, and this peaked, again, interestingly, about 4 months after national media focus on confectionery products containing some amount of sugar, even if this was not sort of overtly negative or overtly targeting the sector, which it was not. So, to wrap up the sort of consumer voice section, cereals were the worst hit in media because of perceived hidden sugar and have not yet done much to offer reduced sugar alternatives, at least visibly sort of in the media or consumer space. Soft drinks were negatively impacted but have effectively neutralized most of this negativity by offering reduced sugar alternatives, with these products driving the majority of consumer discussion. And confectionery typically benefited from sugar coverage because there's an expectation that these products contain sugar, and through comparisons to other perceived to be healthier products with a higher amount of sugar. And consumer advocacy mentions the availability already of sugar-free products. So what then if you're looking to replace sugar in your products? So what alva did is that we then looked not at specific sectors, but at sentiment towards 4 different artificial sweeteners: stevia, ACE-K, aspartame, and saccharin. We analyzed content in mainstream and social media to identify any differences in sentiment or coverage trends. We had a couple of key findings come out of this study, and this is that stevia had the highest sentiment score both in mainstream and social media. It was oftentimes praised as a natural sweetener. And aspartame was discussed most negatively in mainstream and social media. Consumers and the media cited concern around health effects. But interestingly, here we saw sort of criticism or discussion transferring from the social media space to the mainstream media space, where we saw actually the opposite happen with sort of concern around sugar. So first, let's look at mainstream media. We looked at references to these 4 sweeteners over an 8-month period, so May to December 2015. The chart on the left ranks each one of these sweeteners based on sentiment expressed towards each one. As I said, stevia had the highest score, and this was 5.6, which was a net positive, and positive coverage tended to mention this ingredient as a natural sweetener. ACE-K had low visibility, and you can see this on the share of voice chart. It only had about 3%, and coverage was primarily neutral. Saccharin had a net negative score and slightly higher visibility, but aspartame had both the lowest score and the highest visibility in mainstream media. Coverage around aspartame peaked in August, you can see from the volume chart on the bottom right, when a lot of discussion centered around a decision to remove aspartame from some diet soda products. And when we analyzed social media coverage, we found very similar results. ACE-K and saccharin still had low visibility. Aspartame had the highest visibility and the most negative score, and stevia had the highest, most positive score. Though this score wasn't quite as high in social media as it had been in the mainstream media space, signaling perhaps some more doubts around the product in the social media sphere. So here we see that aspartame coverage peaked in July, actually 1 month before its peak coverage in mainstream media, with concern around the ingredient's health effects driving this coverage. Now, interestingly, as I said, while we saw this concern move from mainstream to social media as related to sugar content in specific products or types of products, we saw concern around sweeteners move from social media to mainstream media, signaling that social media is potentially the place to monitor for concern around other sweeteners. So in conclusion, we saw that cereal was the most negatively impacted sector out of the three analyzed in the media space. Consumer concern emerged in the second half of the year around high sugar content in these products. We identified about a 4-month lag period between these two sort of negativity or criticism peaks. Soft drinks had the highest sugar visibility, but the industry effectively neutralized coverage. There was high visibility of reduced sugar products in the consumer space. Sugar content benefited confectionery, often compared to other healthier products. There was overall high consumer advocacy in this space, and again, a 4-month lag period between any sort of social media sort of criticism and critical coverage or significant coverage in mainstream media. Stevia had the highest sentiment score in mainstream and social media, praised as a natural sweetener. Aspartame was discussed the most negatively in mainstream and social media, particularly around concern around health effects, and social media discussion sort of predated the mainstream media coverage. Thank you very much.